Athanasius. Do martyrs die for a mere man? 362 AD, the Nile River, Upper Egypt. Leaning over the rail of the ship, a short, dark-skinned man prayed silently, the breeze tugging at his white beard. As the boat moved forward, he gazed at the villages passing by on the banks of the Nile. Dusty-robed men prodded camels loaded with baskets and heavy bundles along the water's edge. Behind them, the green fields of the fertile river valley rolled out towards the great brown cliffs of the desert. "Old man!" shouted a soldier from an approaching boat. The bearded traveler turned slowly. "Have you seen Athanasius, the bishop of Alexandria? I know he is on the river somewhere. Has he passed by?" It was hot under the scorching Egyptian sun, and the old man wiped beads of sweat from his forehead. The soldier put his hand on the hilt of his sword. "I demand your cooperation in the name of the emperor!" The traveler leaned forward and gazed at the soldier with steady black eyes. "You have almost caught up with him," he said slowly. "Just row a little further." The officer turned at once and shouted to his men, "Get this boat moving. The prisoner is just ahead of us." Immediately the ship bearing the emperor's insignia pulled ahead and was lost in the glare of the sun on the water. The old man heard a chuckle behind him. "You are clever for an old bishop," said the river captain, shaking his head. The old man grinned. "I told him the truth. If he had boarded this boat, he could have arrested me. Emperor Julian should train his soldiers to ask more questions." The bishop's smile disappeared. "Emperor Julian should not tempt God by exiling his bishops. I have spent my whole life preaching the gospel of Jesus. I am no threat to a young emperor." "Don't worry, Bishop," the captain said, clapping Anastasius on the back. "Now that you've sent the soldiers on a detour, it won't be long until we get you into the protection of your friends. They should be used to hiding me by now. This has happened too often. It wastes valuable time I should be spending with my congregation in Alexandria." Then he smiled again. "But I do enjoy visiting my childhood friends in the desert." After the captain left him, the old bishop kneeled on the warm deck to pray. The weathered planks were hard under his stiff knees, but he was grateful for his freedom. "Gracious Father," he prayed, "thank you once again for preserving your humble servant." He thought back to his early days in the desert. He had been born in one of the small villages on the Nile and grew up in a poor family. Because he was short and had dark skin, he earned the nickname Black Dwarf. As a young man, he often sought refuge in the desert with the monks who lived there and cared for him like a son. "Love God," they repeatedly taught. "Value truth. Learn to discipline your body and soul." He was a bold young man with a fiery spirit and strong convictions about the teachings of the Bible. His teachers recommended him to Alexander, the great bishop of the Egyptian city of Alexandria. Alexander ordained him a deacon and made him his apprentice. From the bishop, Athanasius learned how to burn incense, how to care for the poor, how to preach sermons, and how to serve communion. He was impressed with the bishop's strong convictions about Scripture. Soon after Athanasius arrived in Alexandria, he learned that the bishop was involved in a public controversy. Alexander explained one day as they walked together to a hospital for the poor. "As bishop," Alexander said, "it's my job to make sure that the people of the city are being taught the Bible. It is hard work that keeps me preaching, writing books, and training other church leaders like you." "The people seem happy to have you as their bishop," Athanasius said. "They must be learning a lot from you." Alexander sighed. "It is an honor to serve God here, but sometimes my duties are unpleasant. Recently I had to condemn the writings of a local Presbyterian named Arius who claims that Jesus is just a man and not God." The young man stopped walking and stared at the bishop. "If Jesus isn't God, why should we worship him? Do martyrs die for a mere man?" "That is precisely the problem," Alexander exclaimed. "It is a lie that corrupts the very foundations of Christianity. I have demanded that Arius stop teaching this doctrine." "Has he stopped?" "No," the bishop scowled. "Instead, he is challenging my authority. He wrote letters to the bishops of other cities defending his false teaching. Some of them now believe that he is right." They began walking again. How can a Christian believe such a thing about Jesus? Athanasius wondered. Distracted by his thoughts, he stepped into a pile of garbage in the street. He wrinkled his nose and scraped his sandal against a doorstep. "These mistaken bishops are now teaching his ideas to their congregations and defending him," the bishop said, shaking his head. "The church is taking sides over this, Athanasius. There have even been riots in some cities of the empire. Is there any way to stop this? God must be disturbed by such disorder in his church." The only way to stop false teaching is to preach the truth and ask God to give his people the hearts to believe that truth. He paused at the door of the hospital. We can start with the people here that are sick and dying. Let's go in and pray with them. Athanasius began to join Alexander in prayer, and the bishop kept preaching. But the controversy continued. Eventually, Emperor Constantine ordered Alexander and the other bishops to meet and settle the issue. We're going to hold a council of bishops in the city of Nicaea to determine what the Bible really says about Jesus, Alexander told the young deacon. You will go with me as my assistant. In Nicaea, Alexander preached every day and answered the questions of his colleagues. Only the bishops were allowed to attend the meetings, so each evening Athanasius waited in the courtyard for his mentor to come outside and tell him about the day's arguments. They had been debating for many days when Alexander finally had good news. We have done it, he cried, shaking his apprentice by the shoulders. God has opened the eyes of the bishops and the majority has sided with us. What happens now? Arius is banished from the empire and his teachings are officially declared unbiblical. Now we can get back to our work in Alexandria. Sometime later, Alexander felt very ill and called Athanasius to his bedside. You have served me and the church well, he said, with a weak smile. When I am gone, you will be appointed the new bishop. I am not worthy of such a position, the young man insisted. It is a lot of responsibility. I want a quiet life out of the spotlight. God has greatly gifted you, and he will require you to use those gifts. You are a bright and godly man, and the church needs leaders like you who will protect the truth. The congregation agreed. When Bishop Alexander died, they convinced Athanasius to take his place. The new bishop was popular with the people, but like his mentor, it didn't take him long to make a few enemies. Though Alexander had fought hard to prevent it, Arianism was becoming acceptable again in some parts of the empire. Athanasius knew that even if it made him unpopular, it was his job to remind the people what the Bible taught and what the bishops had declared about Jesus at Nicaea, so he wrote several books against Arianism. An urgent message has arrived for you, sir, said his new assistant one day, handing the bishop a document sealed with wax. Athanasius tore open the seal, shaking his head as he read. This is ridiculous. The Arians are trying to disgrace me so people will stop reading my books. Someone started a rumor about me, saying I killed one of my opponents and cut off his hand. Who would believe that about you? Apparently some of the other bishops would. This is a summons to appear before them to answer the charges. Pack my things, Philip. I must leave at once and clear this up. He made a detour on his journey and picked up another traveler. On the appointed day, he entered the courtroom alone. The church officials sat before him in a half circle. He said nothing as he approached, but his alert eyes studied each of the witnesses. They were men he didn't trust. Bishop Athanasius, said the man in charge, you are accused of murdering the teacher Arsenius and cutting off his hand to use for black magic. What do you have to say for yourself? Sir, Athanasius replied with a respectful nod, you accuse me of murdering Arsenius? From the back of the courtroom he brought forward a man wearing a hooded cloak. Do you mean this Arsenius? The bishop yanked off the hood and everyone in the courtroom gasped. That's Arsenius, someone said. He's alive. The official in charge turned to the men who claimed to have witnessed the murder. They whispered furiously to each other. Very well, the judge said. We can see that the teacher is alive, but perhaps you just cut off his hand. Athanasius pulled up the man's sleeve. Do you mean this hand? The teacher's hand trembled nervously, but it was clearly still attached to his arm. The people in the room began to mumble. It was his other hand, someone shouted. Athanasius pulled up the other sleeve. This man still has two hands. He glared at the lying witnesses. Did you think Arsenius was a monster with 3 hands? The courtroom broke into loud laughter. The judge glared at the witnesses and stood up from the table. Bishop Athanasius, you are cleared of the charges against you, he declared. Go in peace. Athanasius hurried out of the building, anxious to return to his church. But as he walked, he realized that things were bound to get worse. It's time I talked to the emperor about these false teachers, he thought. Perhaps I should make the trip to Constantinople now. He headed for the capital of the empire. The walls of Constantinople reached as far as Athanasius could see. Before Emperor Constantine had rebuilt the city and named it after himself, it had been a crumbling ancient town. But now, as he walked through the capital, the bishop passed a number of ornate statues, blocks of beautiful homes, and several public baths where the people came to wash. The streets were full of artists carving sculptures and workers building houses, their hammers clattering against the stone. Everything was brand new. He walked under a row of colorful canopies in the market where merchants displayed their goods for sale. The air was heavy with dust and spices. Fresh fish, the merchants called to him as he passed by. Excellent vegetables, sir. Would you like to buy some lovely pottery? Finally, Athanasius reached the palace and gazed in awe at the gleaming pillars. But once he got inside the gate, he was disappointed. I'm sorry, the imperial aide insisted. Constantine the Great is much too busy to see you. Even Constantine must have time for the church, Athanasius argued. Tell him that I am the bishop of Alexandria. But when the aide returned, the answer was still the same. The emperor cannot be disturbed. Athanasius left the palace discouraged by his failure to arrange a meeting. He stopped at a market stall and bought a loaf of bread. It isn't the emperor's schedule that kept you away, the merchant said, when Athanasius told him of his journey. It is his advisor and Arian teacher who is trying to keep the emperor from being influenced by non-Arians. This issue is even more urgent than I thought, the bishop realized. I'll have to find another way of getting the emperor's ear no matter what it takes. He was heading back toward the palace gates when he noticed two soldiers talking about Constantine. They hadn't seen him. He darted behind a pillar and listened. General Gaius keeps trying to talk him out of it, said one of the soldiers. But you know the emperor. Every morning he saddles his horse and heads through his gate for a long ride in the countryside by himself. No one is swifter with a sword than the emperor. True, but it's still not safe for him to go out alone. You never know who might be waiting for him. That's it, Athanasius thought. Finally, I'll be able to speak to him away from his advisors. It was still dark the next morning when he found a spot on the road just outside the city walls. He crouched under a bush for nearly an hour, waiting for the sound of approaching hooves. There he is! A magnificent stallion galloped around a curve in the stony path, urged on by a rider in gleaming armor. In one quick motion, the small bishop leaned out of the shrubs in front of the horse, grabbing the bridle as the horse reared. Drawing his sword, the expert rider instantly brought the animal under control and forced his blade under the bishop's throat. You dare to attack the emperor? He cried. The horse shook his head in protest, but Athanasius did not release his grip on the bridle. He looked at the emperor's tense muscles and the anger flashing in his dark eyes. Mighty emperor, he said, standing his ground, I mean you no harm. I am the bishop of one of your cities. The emperor's eyes narrowed. Then he gave a short laugh and sheathed his sword. Why would an educated man act so foolishly? He demanded. If I had been less careful, you would be headless now. And I am grateful for your hesitation, my lord, the bishop said boldly, but I must speak with you, and your guards will not admit me into your palace. Hear my case now, and I will leave you to ride in peace. You are a strange little man, Constantine said. I will give you 5 minutes. What is so important that you hunt me like a wild boar? The truth, my lord, that is most important. When the bishop left him, the emperor returned to his palace and told his advisor of the meeting. Why didn't you tell me he was trying to make an appointment to see me? That bishop is a fanatic, insisted the Arian teacher. A man who approaches you in this manner is dangerous. He wasn't carrying a weapon, but he was bold and sincere about his concerns. The advisor frowned and glanced about the room, trying to think of an excuse. My lord, that bishop claims he is powerful enough to stop your shipments of wheat to Rome. He must be removed from leadership. When Athanasius returned home, a messenger was waiting for him. As punishment for your threats against the emperor, you are being exiled from Alexandria, he announced. What threats? I just had an audience with Constantine, and he said nothing about such a false accusation. Prepare to go. An escort will arrive tomorrow to make sure you leave. He was not allowed to argue his case before the emperor. Forced to live far away from his home and his congregation, Athanasius kept preaching and writing about the truth of the gospel. While he was gone, the government of Alexandria appointed a new bishop named Gregory. Word arrived that Constantine had died. Athanasius was allowed to return to Alexandria, but his homecoming was short. Both Athanasius and Gregory claimed to be the rightful bishop, and their supporters started a riot in the city. Constantine's sons, who had taken over the empire after their father's death, blamed Athanasius for the violence, and he was banished again. He longed to be back home. If God wants me to do his work in Alexandria, he told himself, then he will lead me back when the time is right. A council of church leaders voted in favor of Athanasius, convincing the new emperors to return him to his place in Alexandria. Gregory had been such a poor leader that the people welcomed Athanasius as a liberating hero. For the next 10 years he wrote and taught the truth in peace. But the peace did not last. The bishop's assistant knocked at his door one day with a worried expression. What's wrong, Philip? I'm sorry, Bishop. It's another imperial messenger with bad news. I'm getting tired of these visits. What does he want now? Here, see for yourself. He handed Athanasius a message with the imperial seal. My request to see the emperor has been accepted? The bishop raised his eyebrows. I didn't ask to see him. This is a trick. Constantine's son follows the counsel of his father's Arian's advisors. He wants to get rid of you, but you are too popular to banish again. Athanasius threw the parchment down on his desk. Send a reply, Philip. Tell him it seems there has been an error. I did not request an audience with the great emperor and do not wish to waste his time with the simple talk of an old bishop. Philip shook his head as he dipped his quill in an inkwell. He will not like your response. May God protect you. The bishop was serving communion at the church when a troop of soldiers surrounded the building. When their captain gave the order, they rushed in with a shout. In the name of the emperor, hand over the bishop. The people panicked, running for the doors in confusion. The armed soldiers forced their way through the crowd toward the front of the church. But when they got there, the bishop was gone. Outside, a carriage churned up dust as it pulled hastily away from the church. Where am I? Athanasius blinked and leaned out of the carriage. You were helping people escape the soldiers when you fainted, said Philip. In the chaos, we carried you outside. While the soldiers are busy questioning the congregation, we're taking you to the desert. You still have friends there, don't you? They are always happy to see me, he nodded, but for once I would like to visit them under different circumstances. I wonder how long I will be there this time, he thought. He stayed with the desert monks another 5 years and spent most of his time writing more books. When Emperor Julian came to power, Athanasius was allowed to return to Alexandria. Arius is dead now, but the church is still debating his teaching. It is time for another church council, like the one my mentor Alexander attended years ago in Nicaea. He declared soon after his return, Invite all the bishops here, Philip. We must put this issue to rest. Athanasius and the other bishops gathered in Alexandria for many days, studying the Bible together. Philip waited outside to get an update each night on their progress. Eventually, Athanasius emerged with a smile. You must have good news, Bishop. What happened? We are finally united. The bishops have agreed that the Bible teaches that God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit are three distinct persons, but still one God. Then the followers of Arius must stop their false teaching now. This council is the most important thing you have ever done. But not everyone was happy about the outcome of the council. A short time later, Athanasius received a familiar message from Julian. An imperial refugee once again, he now sat on the deck of a ship, waiting for the current to deliver him back to the protection of the desert. The captain says we had a narrow escape, said Philip, coming from below deck to join him. Athanasius nodded. God has preserved me again, he said. I'm old and tired, but I have a feeling it won't be long before I'm back in Alexandria. Wherever you are, you'll be preaching the truth until your last breath. God is faithful, Philip. Though the enemy tries to stop us, the Church of Christ just keeps growing. They stood in silence at the railing and watched the sun slowly sink behind the desert cliffs on the horizon. Athanasius did return to Alexandria and spent his remaining years in peace, writing theology books. Despite the threats and exile he endured, he died of old age in his bed, surrounded by friends.